The last time you were tempted, you probably blamed the moment, didn't you? The stress, the loneliness, the opportunity. But what if the moment was never the problem? What if temptation didn't start there at all? Most people believe temptation happens suddenly, as if it drops out of nowhere and ambushes an innocent person. But that's not how temptation works. Temptation is not an instant event. It is a process. And in today's video, we're going to uncover how temptation actually operates, long before a person ever gives in, so you can stop it early instead of fighting it late. Before we get started, first we must debunk one of the common beliefs people have about temptation. Over the years, people have held on to the belief that temptation often happens because of external pressure, but 99% of the time, this isn't true. Temptation is more of an internal pressure problem before it manifests externally. We know this might sound a bit confusing, but please pay attention. Oftentimes, temptation is misunderstood as an external assault that suddenly happens to an innocent person. However, the scripture and spiritual reality reveal that temptation is not created by circumstances, people, or pressure. Rather, it is the force applied to an already existing thought, desire, or inclination that has been allowed to remain within the heart and mind. James makes this unmistakably clear when he writes in the book of James 1:14 that each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desire and enticed. From this scripture, we can confirm that temptation does not originate outside the individual like we have been led to believe. Instead, it arises from within, where thoughts, imaginations, and desires quietly form long before opportunity ever appears. We are all familiar with the saying, heat does not create impurities in metals, but rather brings them to the surface. The same applies to temptation. It does not manufacture evil, but uncovers it. The truth is, circumstances do not make the person, they reveal the person, because pressure only exposes what has already been cultivated in secret. Another dangerous misconception about temptation is the belief that moral failure happens suddenly, when in reality, temptation unfolds through a deliberate and predictable process that begins in the unseen realm of thought and ends in visible action. Let's explain this thoroughly. Believe it or not, temptation first begins in the thoughts. The thoughts are like the little seeds that are planted in the mind. It first begins when a wrong, selfish, fearful, or impure thought is allowed to enter the mind without resistance, scrutiny, or immediate rejection, creating the first opening through which temptation can grow. In the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 28, which reads, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." We see how Jesus himself teaches that sin is first located in the heart, not the act, even mentioning that to look with lust is already adultery in the heart. This scripture reveals that moral failure begins long before behavior changes. One might believe that just having impure thoughts about something is where they fall into temptation, but this isn't so. For this to happen, the thoughts have to be repeated. Let's clarify this. When a thought is not rejected, it returns, and repetition gives it familiarity, emotional weight, and a sense of normalcy, causing what once seemed offensive to begin feeling acceptable or harmless. And we already know that the mind becomes accustomed to what it repeatedly entertains, and this familiarity slowly weakens resistance. We all know how desire works, don't we? The last time you desired something, remember you couldn't stop thinking about it until you got that thing. This is exactly how temptation works. Once the thought is dwelt upon, the desire becomes fed, and what once appeared wrong begins to look appealing, persuasive, and even justified. Why? It's simply because the imagination has rehearsed the pleasure without confronting the consequence. As a result, this pushes you closer into falling into temptation. In the book of James, chapter 1, verse 15, it says, "Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." This scripture explains that desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, therefore emphasizing that sin is born in the womb of ungoverned desire. We can now see the sequence, right? Now we know that temptation doesn't just happen spontaneously. The truth is, it is only after the inner condition has been shaped that the external opportunity arrives. And when the opportunity presents itself, the response feels automatic because the decision was already made internally long before the moment arrived. What does this tell us? It only reveals that the battle is either won or lost in the mind long before the act ever takes place. So, when next you fall into temptation and you claim it just happened, remember that it didn't just happen. You slowly entertained the thoughts, strengthened your desires, and simply acted based on the content of your heart when you had the opportunity. James Allen's insight that the criminal thought has long been secretly cultivated in the mind and the hour of opportunity reveals its gathered power aligns precisely with biblical truth, because temptation does not force wrongdoing but reveals what has been practiced inwardly. Let's look at this. According to James Allen, the criminal didn't just accidentally show up at the crime scene. It was an impulse reaction. He must have thought about committing the crime long before the opportunity arrived. The opportunity only exposed what was in his heart all along. Many people claim that things like stress, loneliness, and pressure push them to fall into temptation, that is, sin. But in reality, these things do not. They merely trigger what is already present in your mind. This tells us that the source of failure is not circumstance, but a result of undisciplined thought. It is important you know that a single immoral act is rarely sudden. Instead, it is the final fruit of many unnoticed, tolerated, and unchallenged thoughts that were allowed to grow in secrecy until they demanded expression, thereby proving that opportunity does not corrupt, but exposes. Now you have learned about the process of temptation, we expect that this teaching does the following for you. You just moved from unconscious incompetence, not knowing how temptation works, to conscious competence, knowing how temptation works and how to stop it. This transition removes the excuse of "I had no choice" and places responsibility where Scripture places it, that is, on the governance of the heart and mind. This is to say, since temptation originates internally, then victory must also begin internally. When the mind is disciplined early, temptation loses its authority later. Additionally, it's also in your hands to detect temptation from the early stage, thoughts, and stop it before it grows. Public moral failures often shock observers because they appear sudden, yet Scripture reveals that they are the visible outcome of long-hidden inner indulgence, tolerated compromise, and neglected discipline. What is hidden eventually becomes visible, because character always expresses itself when given opportunity. This teaching shifts the focus of spiritual warfare from merely avoiding actions to governing thoughts. We can confirm this in the book of Proverbs 23 verse 7, which says, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he." Again, this is to remind you that victory over temptation begins not at the moment of pressure, but at the moment of thought. By disciplining your thoughts, you can reduce your chances of falling into temptation. Since our thoughts are where it all begins, it's only right we focus on it and seek ways to handle impure thoughts before they sprout in our minds. Why? Because once everything is handled at the thought level, it closes up the door for falling into temptation. You might be asking, can't I just avoid having impure thoughts? A simple yes or no cannot answer this. But to be on the safe side, it's important you know that the first and most critical strategy for overcoming temptation is learning to govern the thought at its earliest appearance. By this, we simply mean, once you have an impure thought or it sneaks up on you, you handle it immediately. This is because whenever you have a thought, it will likely arrive weak and can be easily dismissed. However, the longer it is entertained, the stronger it becomes. As a believer, to overcome temptation early, you must examine thoughts as they enter your consciousness. You can examine by asking whether the thought aligns with the character you desire to develop, the life you are building, and the person God is shaping you to become. If it doesn't, then it must be discarded. When a thought is rejected early, it dies weak and powerless. But if by any chance it is entertained, it will grow to become persuasive and demanding. Did you know that rejecting or discarding the thought is not just enough? Yes, it isn't. You must replace it. This is where many believers fail. They reject the thought and forget to replace it. As a believer, it is imperative you know that resistance alone is insufficient. This is because the mind cannot remain empty, and nature allows no vacuum. This means that when one thought is rejected, another must immediately replace it. Now, this is the tricky part, because many believers just replace the impure thought with any random one, and it shouldn't be so. In a situation where you're battling with something impure, you must replace it with a pure, scriptural, and positive thought that completely overshadows the impure thought. Scripture repeatedly calls believers to set their minds on things above. We can confirm this in the book of Colossians 3:2, which says, "Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things." This is because noble thoughts, truth, purity, purpose, and self-command naturally overpower lower desires without constant struggle. To win this battle of the mind, you must not be fixated on what must be avoided. Rather, by filling your mind with the things that must be pursued. Did you know that one of the reasons temptation thrives is because we have not disciplined ourselves and our minds enough? That's right. You should know that temptation thrives in a neglected mind, but discipline sharpens awareness, builds inner strength, and makes self-control habitual rather than reactive. Just as physical exercise trains the body to respond with strength and endurance, mental and spiritual discipline train the mind to respond with restraint, clarity, and authority when temptation arises. A disciplined mind recognizes danger early, resists naturally, and recovers quickly when challenged. If you were told that the reason you constantly fall into temptation is because of your loose convictions, would you believe that? Well, you better do, because we have proof. You should know the strongest defense against temptation is not fear of consequence, but clarity of conviction, because when desire is aligned with principle, temptation loses its attractiveness. A person who knows what they stand for, what they refuse to become, and what kind of life they are intentionally building will find that temptation appeals less powerfully to them. You might be asking, why? It's simple, because it conflicts with their identity. Do you remember when Jesus resisted temptation in the wilderness after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights? It was not by argument, but by unwavering commitment to truth, responding each time with, "It is written." We can confirm this in the book of Matthew 4, verses 1 to 11. Jesus proved that with solid convictions and unwavering commitment to the truth, one can overcome any kind of temptation. Did you know that temptation has no power of its own except you give it power? Many believers have failed to understand that temptation has no inherent authority, it only has permission. This means that temptation by itself cannot compel obedience, but can only persuade. This truth is liberating because it reveals that temptation does not control behavior. Your consent does, and persuasion fails against a governed mind rooted in truth and discipline. Scripture affirms this by promising that God will always provide a way of escape. not by removing temptation, but by strengthening resistance. We can confirm this in the book of 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, which says, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." While a lot of believers view temptation as a terrible thing, the truth is that temptation also has its positive sides for every believer. Let's take a look at a few. There's a popular saying that goes, "You do not know your true character until you're wealthy." The exact same thing applies to temptation. Many believers think they know their true character until they have been tempted. The truth is, temptation exposes weaknesses that require discipline, thoughts that need correction, and desires that must be purified, thereby acting as a diagnostic tool rather than a destructive force. This tells us that you discover who you truly are under pressure, not in comfort. As a believer, you should know that each temptation you resist builds inner authority, increases self-respect, and deepens self-trust. Not just that, it develops moral confidence, proving that victory compounds strength over time. Always remember that what is resisted today becomes easier to resist tomorrow. Have you ever considered temptation as a gateway to growth? If you haven't, you should. The truth is, as a believer, without temptation, there can be no self-mastery, no moral progress, and no refinement of character. This is because growth requires resistance, just as muscle requires weight to grow. Let's put it this way. The same way friction sharpens steel is the same way temptation sharpens the soul if mastered. Life is governed by law, and those who neglect inner discipline become ruled by impulse and circumstance, while those who master temptation shape their destiny consciously and rise above external conditions. The difference between collapse and conquest is not opportunity, but preparation. To overcome temptation before it overcomes you is to understand that victory is decided long before pressure appears, in the quiet governance of thought, desire, and discipline. Those who learn to rule their inner world will not be ruled by their outer world, and those who discipline the mind will walk in freedom, authority, and moral strength in every season of life.